of strategic communications work across North America. So we do tons of municipality work. We do lots and lots of nonprofit work, lots of corporate work, and then crisis communications. And today I want to talk a bit about AI and community engagement and reporting and just what's beyond that basic chat GPT out there for people that are usually under-resourced and under invested in their roles. And so, how do we become more efficient with the tools that we have? So, I'm pretty relaxed. And so don't ever hesitate to interrupt me or ask a question. I really like it. So just feel free to use that chat tool. And if I don't see it, like raise a hand or something like that, and hopefully I'll see it. So and I want to apologize. I'm actually at a different conference. I presented from about an hour ago to a different audience, and now I'm in their business services center at this conference space. And so hopefully we're all going to have good internet connection and audio. So we do lots of crisis and issues management. And so everything that, needs a lot of stakeholder engagement. So, a shareholder charged with fraud in the USA. We've had murders on sites, employee fatalities where the employer's at fault. We do a lot of chemical spills. I live in Canada. I'm in Western Canada at the base of the Rocky Mountains in Calgary, Alberta. And so I do a lot of work in the oil and gas and natural gas industries as well. But we've worked with, sexual violence, disabled communities, supervised consumption, the gender and sexually diverse communities, and prides across North America, pride marches and organizations. So we really have done the gamut of different topics along the way and are, you know, uh, handling different conversations and in communities that are having those conversations in a very under very tense circumstances a lot. So really I am very invested in AI. I'm actually doing an MBA at the moment that focuses on on AI and communications. So this is really a passion of mine, how we can all work more efficiently and um, move forward using AI safely and recognizing the ethics of it and being transparent about that and also understanding the biases that show up. So, in terms of how we can use this, we really see that different tools allow us to listen smarter, analyze deeper, respond faster, which is what all of the communities that we've worked with are all expecting of us at this point. So, in terms of that basic evolution, now this is a very basic visual of that, but we've seen kind of those basic automations of simple chat box, keyword-based sorting, feedback forms, that kind of thing. Now it's moving towards natural language processing, understanding context, tone, sentiment is really important, and especially in large communities where we're measuring sentiment on certain topics, and sentiment can be different in different cultural contexts. So we have to measure that differently in different areas. And then research platforms. And in terms of community engagement, we've used CoLoop a lot, but there's a million other competitors to CoLoop that are doing really great work in terms of that qualitative analysis and citation-backed insights. So as we see AI maturing, we're seeing and understand context and biases and hallucinations. So ChatGPT's newest version has many fewer, especially on research, hallucinations, although there's still very common. So we have to be looking at that. But bias is really what we want to be watching for, especially as we do having some of these important conversations. So, in terms of that data collection, um, I'm really using it on our larger community conversations to consolidate community feedback, interviews, and surveys into a unified platform. We want to synthesize insights in minutes rather than weeks. And so, anybody that has seen how expensive it is for an organization or a municipality to hire an agency to do this work, it's so expensive. But with AI, we can really start to democratize these services and allow for this research to be done in a much more effective way. So we want to be able to look at open-ended responses at scale. And if anybody has done town halls on very controversial topics, you know that safety is now something that we're all talking about. And so, from my perspective, our bigger cities that are clients of ours don't want to have in-person events anymore. The security is too expensive and it's high risk. From an HR perspective, putting people in those conversations is high risk. So to be able to do it from a database perspective online, we can really start to collect these open-ended responses at scale that, and then translate that data into synthesized insights for council or for board very quickly, which really appeals to so many different organizations. So we're really seeing those emerging themes and sentiment patterns, and then citation-backed findings for accountability. So we're using it in a lot of different conversations, from everything from municipal infrastructure to things like supervised consumption, or the gender and sexually diverse community and human rights for those communities, and who's making the decisions in the, I know this is for IAP2 USA, but I'm in Canada and where we have public health care. And so our province and politicians are having conversations right now about gender affirming care. And those are very complex conversations that I don't believe politicians should be having alone. And so we're doing a lot of those community conversations in order to collect information on where there's a lack of understanding and a lack of education, and where we can get feedback so that our politicians can make more informed choices. Excuse me. Um, so as I mentioned, Coloop is the one that we're using, but I don't get a kickback from Coloop or anything like that. I'm not promoting them. It's just a tool that we've used in the past. So we really, and there's a million out there. So if you look at Coloop competitors, you can see a bunch of different options. But Coloop and all of its competitors are really, and depending on price point, they can really handle those conversations and responses at scale, which is the benefit that a ChatGPT, for example, can't. So ChatGPT can incorporate in a conversation up to 10 different interviews and give that extraction of themes, give a sentiment analysis, and link some citations, but it's limited. So if you're only having 10 conversations, I would argue that that's probably not an effective engagement pattern, and it wouldn't give you enough data to make too many predictions based on it, or actionable insights based on it. But these other tools are really allowing us to do this at, how do you have a conversation with 3 million people? Or how do you have a conversation with 300,000? And then how do you keep all of that data, all of the surveys, interviews, transcripts uploaded securely? Because you are now responsible for, especially conversations that we're having are very sensitive and should be protected and need to be protected. And so when we look at understanding AI, we have to look at making sure that we're protecting that information in a way that matches our values and matches the ethical standards of what an agency would do in the past in terms of having these conversations. Now, we can never talk about AI without having what we call HITL, human in the loop. There always has to be human review. And so all of these conversations about how AI is taking jobs and yada, 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 I do think um, the people that will continue to have jobs are the people that understand how to utilize AI, understand its limitations, understands the bias that it has when it comes to giving us analyses, and understand the ethics that it takes to use AI appropriately. And those conversations are happening every day, all day. If I could, if I had nothing but time and money, I would spend all of my research time on AI ethics and the conversations that's having. The people that write the code, the cultures that they come from are influencing the decisions and the outputs that AI has. So, in my MBA program, one of the conversations we have is, who's writing the code for a self-driving car? If a car is coming up on and an old person, an older senior citizen falls in front of them, do they swerve to avoid the older senior citizen and potentially hit a car with a family in it? Or do they hit the older senior citizen and protect the young family that might have a baby in the car? And the person that makes those decisions and the group of people that make those decisions, the decision that they make is dependent on where they live and what culture they grew up in. In North America, we tend to protect the younger family. In Asian cultures, they tend to protect and value the senior. And so these are the conversations that I find fascinating, and how globally we're going to have to make some pattern adjustments, agreements in order to figure out how we're going to use AI in a much more expansive role. So I work with a number of different communities, and so that could be immigrant communities, it could be communities that English is not their first language. Even, I live in Canada, and so culture in the province that I live in of Alberta is very different than Prince Edward Island. We do a ton of work in Texas. Cultural nuances between those areas are so different. And so as we see AI becoming more expansive, we're seeing um, more understanding of that nuanced dialogue. So, Claude is another tool, Claude AI, that really came on the market with a much better writing pattern. I found the writing to be a much more nuanced dialogue. It understood subtlety more. There was better context. There was more complex community narratives that were far beyond what we'd seen in the past. It's really good at summarizing lengthy documents, sentiment detection across cultural contexts, and high quality content generation for reporting. So I really like combining some of those tools like Coloop, where it takes massive amounts of data and interviews. It can take them as an audio file, it can take them as a written file, it can convert them into data that Claude can take and then summarize all of that data into different kinds of reports. And especially for municipalities where, or politicians that maybe are trying to understand a community's standpoint on different topics, and also understand the research behind the topic and understand where there's misinformation and disinformation. So it allows me to give a lot of giant pieces of information in a more condensed format. And I find Claude being a tool that allows me to do more of that in a more nuanced way, especially with different communities. And I do lots of work in different immigrant communities across North America. And so anything that has ability to work with people where English isn't their first language or they have a strong accent, it allows me to work more effectively. So this is one of the tools that I really like. Now, we all can have many different discussions on, okay, which tool do you like best and the ethics behind the tool. So, there's lots of conversation right now in the news around Grok having the capabilities around sexualized imagery of children, whereas ChatGPT doesn't. Now, OpenAI that owns ChatGPT, we just had a school shooting, our worst ever in Canadian history, school shooting in Tumbler Ridge in northern BC recently. And the person that was the shooter was found to have planned that attack using ChatGPT. When our federal government investigated that, they did see that ChatGPT knew about it. It had been escalated to senior leadership. It had been recommended that they report that to our federal police or RCMP. They chose not to. They shut the account down. The person then just opened a new account and then continued to plan a very effective attack. So, um, we're having these conversations around what are the ethical considerations for each of these tools. And Claude is no different. As most of you probably know and have seen in the news, the American federal government is looking at Claude and seeing how it might be disruptive around supply chain. Now, all of these conversations are evolving, and um, as AI grows, it's growing so fast. We're all just trying to keep up to figure out how does this match our values, which tool works best for us, which tool is, are we willing to tolerate, some of these sidebar conversations around how these tools have been used in order to do our jobs more effectively? Is that worth it for us? And I really think these conversations are so important for us to have. I'm not even touching on the environmental implications of AI. It's out of the scope of this conversation today, but I don't think you can talk about a tool that utilizes so much energy and ethics and not consider ethics as a part of that. But today we're focusing on the communication side. So we really want to look beyond the basic chat GPT or chat bots. We want to look at AI for reporting and engagement, and looking at how to integrate AI throughout all of our workflows. And so some of the work that we've been doing in our office is how to integrate AI into different workflows and different offices, and in order for them to perform more effectively, with more accuracy, with more efficiency on the same budget. So, how do you scale your organization's capacity to do a better job without increasing your labor expenses? And I really believe that AI is the future of this. So, the automated report generation. Now, I'm never suggesting that AI is going to give you a final draft of anything, but when we look at taking raw data from community reporting and turning that into a synthesized piece of data that has a well-written report that can be distributed back to the community and back to decision makers, it can save weeks and weeks of manual work. And if you're paying for it through an agency, that can be hundreds of thousands of dollars. So, where I really like to see organizations play with some of these tools is thinking about, okay, where can we increase that efficiency without scaling up with a new person, but also integrate this in an appropriate way, in a way that data is protected, in a way that anonymity is protected, so that if someone is saying, you know, that they're an immigrant into the community and they want to give feedback, but they feel like it might be unsafe, that we are there to protect them. In my community right now, with the gender and sexually diverse population in the big cities where, it's very safe and well accepted to be a transgendered person and very common. And but you go to the rural communities and it may not be so. And so we want to make sure that anybody who's talking about these sensitive conversations can do so in a safe way and their anonymity is protected. So if you're working with these populations, you need to be able to make sure that the tools that you're using are going to respond with care, um, respond without bias, which is very difficult to do. So then you have to incorporate that in, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then also protect the data that you collect. And as we see cyber attacks and cyber breaches happening on a daily basis, it's harder and harder to do that. But tools like Claude have all of that reporting as to how they do protect data, very transparent. So I encourage you to figure out what is appropriate for data protection, what isn't, and how to invest in it so that the tools that you have aren't just the free versions. What I'm seeing most in my practice is our clients have staff that are using AI regularly, even if there's a policy in place to not use it, but they're using shadow tools. So their personal cell phones, their personal computers, they're using a free version of ChatGPT or Claude. They're putting in sensitive data in order to efficiently turn that content around. And then they're exposing the organization for risk of that data breach. And so this is why I'm encouraging all of my clients to put those AI guardrails in place so that your staff can use it because they're using the tools anyway, but make sure that they're using the premium versions where confidentiality and the data is protected. But we want that real-time feedback analysis. We want the personalized engagement. We want to be able to ask everybody in the community that we're talking to for their opinion and have them be able to speak to us in a way that isn't limited. So we want to make sure that we have the tools in place to do that. So the critical challenge, though, is recognizing bias. So as we all know, AI has learned from what's on the internet. And if you think of what's on the internet and all of the garbage that's there, as well as all of the great information, this is where we see the challenge of bias arise. So even in my office, we do tremendous amounts of training and education for especially our marginalized communities. Um, but we move so fast as well when we're putting together some of these, even just presentations and we're using AI. AI typically will, I find, especially with imagery, pick stereotypes around marginalized communities and what they look like. Um, and sometimes be offensive. And so we have to have lots of conversations about, okay, well, why was this image chosen versus that image? Is this the right image to display? This data is really reflecting historical inequities that have just been collected on the internet. And so, um, really, we see our cultural evolution happening on the internet, which is scary to say, and then AI synthesizing and regurgitating it back to us if we're not careful. So, design choices embed assumptions about language, culture, demographics that I encourage you to be so cautious around. And this isn't easy. I know this isn't easy. It takes so much, so many resources to invest in cultural sensitivity training or historical inequity training. In my community with our Indigenous populations, with, even just our how different our pride marches are for our community versus a community in Texas or on the other side of our country, on the maritime side. They're very different. They've had different historical inequities, they've had different experiences, and they've had different demographic makeup. And so you can't just make those assumptions or trust that AI is going to do that accurately. So this is where that human in the loop becomes so important. So the real world impact is that bias sentiment can really um, skew community perceptions. So we want to make sure that, for example, dialects aren't labeled as negative, or we don't underrepresent certain voices that are marginalized because the bias is inherently built into our AI tools. So this is something where you can see you can't just push data into AI, have it regurgitate a report and trust that it's accurate. You have to have the ability to assess the data that is sent back out. You have to be able to assess whether bias was, where the bias is happening, because it's going to happen, where maybe it's not matching your values on how it's regurgitating that data. Not that you would change the data, but you need to think about how is it going to be sensitively distributed back to the community. So these are things that you have to be sensitive to and thinking about all the time. So in terms of the mitigation strategies we use in our practice, we're looking at diverse data sets. We always employ human in the loop review. We invest so heavily in education and training on AI, not just AI, but then how bias shows up. So that means we have to know the communities we serve pretty well. which isn't cheap. To have us go in and understand a community that we've never been in is often, takes time, and especially to do it properly, the due diligence it takes, it's a big investment. So we have to be looking at how we educate ourselves as humans in the loop to regularly audit the bias that AI outputs. So it's a really interesting conversation. It's a body of work that is evolving, and I encourage you to get more and more training on it as we move forward. I think probably everyone here has experienced a hallucination through AI on earlier versions of ChatGPT. So, especially the 3 and 4 versions, hallucinations were very common, especially in the deeper research. The new deep research on 5.2 is pretty effective, but we still use an intern to check every source before we trust it. And then misinformation is common in AI as well. So this is where we see false or inaccurate or misleading outputs generated by the LLMs that we're using. So, um, you can imagine one piece of hallucinated data can erode years of organizational trust. But we are seeing public policy and from our politicians being developed by AI now. And we just had a piece of legislation built in the province I live in purely with AI. Now, there were humans in the loop, but this is the direction that we're going. It's such an effective, efficient use of time and research, but it has to be done appropriately. And do we always trust our politicians to do that effectively? I would say no. But we can certainly educate ourselves in order to do this properly. So this is where fact checking, citation linking, and transparency really come into play. And we lean very heavily into this. Um, in terms of, I think I've covered the ethical use of AI in community engagement, but that privacy and data security is so important. So, this is, two sides of a sword here, or a blade when we think about it. Community data is sensitive. We want to protect and make sure that that data is encrypted. There's consent to the encryption, to the collection of the data. There's compliance with data protection regulations in every state that you're in, that you're compliant every step of the way. But then also, if you hear something that's a threat to someone's safety or could be a threat or is maybe a risk factor of mental health, how are you reporting that data? And have you got consent to report that from the person that you're collecting data from? This is a huge conversation that both of our federal governments are having right now. Canada is leading the charge just because of the Tumbler Ridge incident and ChatGPT, knowing that perpetrator was planning that attack more effectively because of their use of OpenAI, ChatGPT. And so we're having to have the conversations of, okay, if you're a minor, what is the responsibility and accountability of the AI company that's working with them in order to report and then how are they going to manage the additional manpower it takes in order to do that when, as we all know, AI, their pricing models haven't been quite set yet. They're still trying to figure out how to price that work. And, we're starting to talk about, like, just as we saw the dot-com bubble burst, we're talking about AI's bubble bursting. These are all conversations that we're having, and they're not going to be done quickly, and it's not going to be an easy conversation because it revolves around privacy and how data is collected and who reports on what. And then we start to get into that big brother type of conversation of how much monitoring do we want and who gets access to the information we're sharing. And then we think, then we go to the conversation of inclusivity, non-discrimination. These are massive conversations about equitably, how we treat sorry, how we treat our communities in an equitable fashion. And we want to be crossing barriers of language and culture and abilities and socioeconomic backgrounds, and then sexuality and gender. So these are very complex conversations. They take a lot of information and they take a lot of experience in order to do properly and well. And so then if we're using AI to have them, we better make sure that we understand those conversations well. Um, okay, I just want to go to the questions here. Okay, so thanks, Aaron. Brooke, I have a question about how to best set whoops, sorry, there's come a couple popping in. Set up data collection for quality analysis. We aren't always able to ascribe demographic information to specific comments. So I'm wondering how you might address that to extrapolate learning from AI analysis. Typically, that's transparency on what was collected in order to what demographic information you do have. You might say and be fully transparent that we have no information on who is giving this. It's completely anonymous. Here's the data. And as long as you're transparent about that, then people can extrapolate the information as they see fit, given that that's not something that you've collected. And then Sherry Dawn says, do you have any favorite samples of statements that disclose AI use on public platforms? I do. If you email me after, I can give you some links to that. And I'll show you my email address. Everybody can email me. I'm happy to share that. On the transparency side, when AI is heavily used to understand survey data, community inputs, is that stated in the report? Yes, it should be. How prevalently? Seems like it should be early and obvious, but you don't want to alarm people. Absolutely. So this is that transparency question. People are afraid to say that they have used AI because it almost feels like cheating still. And I think this is where more education has to be done around we're using AI in order to have larger, more in-depth conversations with our community. This is the benefit of it. This is how we're protecting you from a data security position, from a privacy place, from a bias position, from hallucinations. This is how we're protecting you. So you can't just walk into use of AI. And I always compare it to, and this is probably if anybody comes from the medical background here, it's probably not a great comparison, but fentanyl, we all have a terrible opioid problem in our communities right now. Fentanyl is a great drug in the hospital when it's being used by a doctor that's trained to use it. And if anybody's had someone passing in hospice or in palliative care, fentanyl is a life, at end of life, it's one of those things that brings comfort to someone in tremendous pain. And you see it used in such an effective way. And then you also see the bad side of it when it's not used by someone who knows what they're doing. And so this is where we have to be trained in order to use AI effectively, but then also trained in how we communicate to the people who are taking our data that we have used AI and say, this is how we've used it responsibly. So this is so important. You can't just utilize AI and then not be transparent about it. And everybody's using AI now, but it's something that we have to talk more about and then talk about the background that we have in order to use it safely and effectively. So it's really important that I feel like, especially in community reporting, it's really important that we are transparent about that. Jose, you asked, what do I mean about sentiment? Does it mean that in documents the intensity or level of anger or happiness on a topic that someone has when speaking at a public meeting? Absolutely. So I'm in the PR world as well. So when we look at monitoring social media in a community about a controversial monument, for example, we were just a couple years ago, we had this monument to um, a surgeon that was a surgeon during the Civil War on the Confederate side. It was a community that received a number of Black people through the Underground Railroad, and that was never talked about. But here we were having a monument on the main street to a surgeon that was on the Confederate side. So a conversation had to be had about, do we keep the monument? Do we move it to a museum? Do we destroy the monument? Do we educate the community more on the Underground Railroad and what the Civil War looked like. We're in Canada. Is the Civil War actually something that we should be spending money on? All of those things. We can measure sentiment on a comment, a question. Um, we can measure, is the community bubbling up for potentially a protest or a riot? Are they, and we can get that triggered really fast. So that's what I mean when I say sentiment measurement. Sherry Dawn says, along the same lines, my instinct is that it's valuable to highlight when people are interacting with a human. For example, this email chat is proudly responded to by a human. Absolutely. And other humans really, especially on a chat tool, respond well to that. So talk about positive sentiment. When you actually get a human that you're talking to, as opposed to a chat bot, people do respond really well. Alex says, do you have any examples of Canadian municipalities who've worked with or know that use AI safely, effectively, and transparently? Yes. I have worked with many different municipalities across the country. Right now, we're representing all of them in PEI. We have tested different GPTs. So under ChatGPT, you can build your own GPT for brand voice and tone. And so we have experimented with different GPTs on general community updates. Now, higher risk conversations or uh, certainly crisis communications. I see municipalities using them to help guide them through to make sure they're not missing different stakeholder groups. So I don't know of any municipalities who aren't using AI, first of all, in some form or fashion. Now, that could be a shadow tool where the organization, the municipality, has not allowed them to use or not purchased an AI tool that's effective for comms. So, for example, we see a lot of organizations or municipalities buying chat or Copilot, which is the Microsoft ecosystem AI tool. Any communicator that's used Copilot, it's not as good as Claude or ChatGPT. And so I often find the communicators going back to the shadow tools that they prefer that has more effectiveness on how they use the tool. Now, I am not sure I can communicate publicly which ones I think are using AI best. Um, because they're all using it. I'm only working with the communications departments or on certain kinds of projects where public participation is necessary, so infrastructure or something like that. So most of my things have been protected by confidentiality. But if you wanted to email me, we could have a quick phone call and I can talk to you about the ones that we have implemented guardrails for the municipality to work effectively. Um, Okay, Brooke, I'll answer Brooke's question and then Aaron, I'll come back to yours and I'll keep track. I see there's lots of questions coming up here. So Brooke says, can you say more about how you are seeing AI used in real time in public meetings to synthesize questions or themes? What tools are available to do that? Yes. So in the bigger cities we represent, most of them are not using um, public meetings where people show up in person as common because of safety and security costs around them. We're seeing more and more of the bigger cities doing purely online engagement. Now, the problem with that is you miss so many people in different communities. So maybe the seniors don't have the proper tools to log in, don't know how. So it really, you lose a lot of people, or maybe there's groups that are in different socioeconomic backgrounds that don't have access to computers that could log in, those kinds of things. Um, so that's not a perfect solution. And our more small towns, hamlets, townships, they're still doing those public meetings, and we do them both online and in person. And I see them using tools like CRISP, KRISP.ai, does a really good job of transcribing, but I find it's really important for me to have a colleague entering in, town townsperson number one, townsperson number two, so we can separate who's speaking when we don't necessarily know their names. So those kinds of things, it's kind of a two-person job. Sometimes it's more depending on how big the community is. So Crisp is doing a really good job of transcribing that and separating who's speaking. And then ideally, you would have that who's speaking very, very controlled at a mic. They have to line up, those kinds of things. But anybody that's done town halls regularly knows that, especially on those more challenging conversations, people get very upset and start lobbing questions your way without using the mic. You have to shut that down in order to get them back into um, that format so that you can ethically, or not ethically, you can responsibly separate who's speaking from the next person and allow the tool to collect the information. So we use that all the time in conjunction with video analysis. We're taking video of people's faces. Again, that's all very transparent. We say that we're taking audio and video recordings for the final report so we can do a report back to community on what we heard. Those kinds of conversations are really important to have. So we set organizations up with the process to do this and the tools. And sometimes it's just here's your toolkit. We have a course that we offer on these communication skills. Like, here's your toolkit. Here's how you use them. Here's how you get. So if you're coming from a small town or a hamlet that doesn't have a budget to have an agency come in and set you up and manage it themselves, then you can take a course to do it for a fraction of the cost and look at that. So I'm just going to push through here. And Aaron, I promise to come back. Ethical AI in question. So when you look at how it's used, there's always challenges. So if we look at this was a case study that we did. So we gathered 2,000 plus survey responses and then 50 in-person interviews using co-loops upload tools. So we AI itself, because we asked it to, we have very sophisticated prompts. And prompt engineering is something I could talk about all day. If you're putting in a one sentence prompt, you are not using AI to its full advantage. My prompts are typically, they could be 1,500 words, and I'm asking it to look for bias, to check sources, to look for hallucinations, to check for, like, to understand the community I'm serving, to understand. I put lots of content in around who the community is, what's important to them in this context. And so you can understand, I had a case study or a client where we were working with a very unpleasant, unpopular topic of supervised consumption in community. So this is where someone uses illicit drugs in front of a nurse. And so when that person has an overdose and dies, the nurse revives them with naloxone and a naloxone kit in place in the community. And so in the large city that we were working in, it was a gentrified community, very wealthy, but they were finding people that had passed away in the night in their front lobbies of these ritzy ditzy, um, uh, um, oh, I can't think of the word, like apartments, but fancier, where you own them. I apologize. My mind has just gone blank. And so in that community, we were talking about you don't have to bring your children down um, and experience this. It's awful. And we were losing two people a day in our community to opiate use. And so that community really responded to let's not have dead people. Let's revive these people. Let's help them get into treatment. Now, just further down the road, it's a very senior community. It's a rural community. It's very conservative. They responded to, okay, what's the cost of a full-time nurse monitoring people using illicit drugs in this community? It would only cost the cost of one nurse per year in that small community versus the cost of sending out first responders to someone who had overdosed at the side of the road. And in Canada, so first responders would be include police, ambulance, and fire. So that alone is $1,500 every 5 minutes. And then that person has to be taken to the hospital. They're given naloxone, but there's so many comorbidities when it comes to drug use that that person would then be put into a bed. And then that is an acute care bed, which costs a tremendous amount of money. And then now we have to look at what are there other problems that need to be treated now that they're in the healthcare system. So from a taxpayer perspective, we're comparing the cost of a nurse to revive them with a free naloxone kit versus the cost of an acute care bed for potentially 3 to 6 months. So you have to understand the community you're speaking to understand what is going to resonate with them in terms of messaging. And so that's where this data collection really comes up. And so bias discovery is so important. You have to understand the community you're speaking to first, whether English is their first language, we have to understand that. We have to translate their interviews. We have to translate effectively and understand different dialects. In my community, in my province, we have lots of French speaking individuals, but it's Quebecois French, it's not France French. In Texas, we have a lot of people that were, immigrants that had newly come to the country that had spoken different dialects of different languages. And so we had to understand, okay, are we actually properly translating their interview if this dialect is more rare than their counterparts in other areas? So all of those things had to be considered, and AI can help us do that, especially with the dialect conversation. And again, I could talk for an hour on translation tools alone, but this is where we really want to understand. And then culturally, I'm going to speak differently about people with addiction issues if I'm a white, privileged female growing up in Canada versus especially in Western Canada, versus if I'm in a rural community that is in the Maritimes. My cultural difference is I'm probably going to be louder, I'm going to be more opinionated, whereas in the Maritimes, they're very polite, they're quiet. Texas is very different again, and then there's gender norms. Are we incorporating all of those pieces into the conversation when we look at bias and understand bias discovery? Now, I'm not saying this is easy, but this is where AI can help us have those conversations in a more effective way. And insight validation. So this is where we lean on community liaison for accuracy, and especially when we're working with different cultures, and then transparency and delivery. So again, these conversations, these case studies, you can see how AI is helping. But the conversations are also becoming more complex. And thank goodness they're becoming more complex because our community makeup is so diverse and it should be diverse. Is what makes us interesting, and that's what makes communities interesting. But unless we understand that, and that diversity and where people are coming from and respect it, then we won't understand why they're reacting to certain topics in certain ways. And then as communicators, especially on projects like infrastructure that have to happen, we want to be able to properly and effectively communicate so those communities understand. So AI is a tool. It is never a decision maker. And we have to have those humans in the loop. We have to communicate and be transparent. And I think community engagement is becoming more and more important. It's essential to making decisions, and it's essential to doing it correctly. But because we're so diverse and so interesting as humans, we can only utilize AI more in order to get the complexities of those individual understandings and have it help us make decisions more effectively. So, in terms of ethical deployment, this is a practical framework. Again, this is very simplified. So, vet your tools. So, Claude has a really good AI due diligence checklist that I encourage you to take a look at. But you can look at each of them and ask the AI tool, what is your due diligence checklist? How do you protect privacy? How do you audit for bias? How do I prompt you to audit for bias? How do I evaluate which is the right tool for me? Ask AI these tools, give it these complex prompts, and then ask it to defend its work and defend its recommendation. And then we always want to close the loop so that AI is shaping the use of our community engagement tools, but it's not giving the community feedback. We are giving the community feedback. We are using AI as a tool to close that loop. So we want to always make sure that we're accountable, inclusive, and continuously approving. improving, sorry. So future trends, we're going to see more of those co-designed solutions in real time, and those participatory platforms. They're going to grow. Inclusive feedback, which is something I really love. I came from an immigrant family. You can't have a handle like ClawCheck without being an immigrant family. But I also knew like how important certain conversations were to my family, and it my family's experience in they came from Eastern Europe, and especially during World War II and after World War II, everything from that experience shaped every decision of theirs going forward, and it shaped their lives. And I truly believe unless we understand where people are coming from, then we can't properly understand what their feedback is giving us. We need to understand those nuances. And as a communicator, I'm not communicating that very well, but the AI is allowing me to have more in-depth conversations. And if someone has come from a war-torn country, if someone has come as a refugee, if someone has come from a different socioeconomic background, if someone has a lifestyle that is safe for them in our urban communities, but unsafe in our rural communities, how are they going to respond when I ask them a question about gender and sport? They're going to answer very differently. And unless I can create safety for them, and I create safety through understanding, AI allows me to do that more effectively with more people. So, predictive insights, inclusive feedback, and allows us to move faster as crises. But like, so hopefully we can move before a crisis emerges. Hopefully we can engage people with understanding before a crisis emerges. As we see more protests disrupting operations, hopefully we can educate communities more effectively on where their community partners are coming from. All of these things have so much. I have so much hope for them in the future as to how they can support us. So if you wanted to try ChatGPT in action, I would give you a case or a bit of an audience participation tool here to just try out. So if you think about what are some of the topics that you're working on, give it a question. So and feel free to give it a question, a challenging question. So, one of the conversations that we're having around AI, how do we assess bias in our AI tools? And you can say to ChatGPT, this is the community I live in. This is 10 avatars. Three are this age, three are that age, four are this. And, give them different political backgrounds, give them different socioeconomic backgrounds, give them different cultural experiences, then give a survey and ask ChatGPT to create survey responses from each of these people. Upload that sample data, ask it to generate insights. And I've given you a little bit more for each one just to play with. Ask it to detect bias. Then try it with Claude, see how it works. Then try it with Grok, see how it works. Use the free versions because none of this is real information. Test how it works in order to see what you think is the best tool for you and which one to invest in. And then start to invest in the guardrails and how you're going to implement it. And I would argue public participation, community engagement specialists, stakeholder engagement, they should have different tools than the rest of your operational teams. I don't find Copilot to be as effective as some of the others. So, challenges, bias persistence, hallucination risks, digital equity. Not all communities have equal access to to digital tools that will allow you to input it into your AI tools. But the opportunities are we can scale on such a impactful level. We can deepen trust by communicating better and having stronger community relationships, and then inclusive reach. So I love the fact that this allows me to have conversations with people where English isn't their second language, and I can build relationships with them where I understand where they're coming from. We may disagree, but at least I can understand the background and why they're choosing to lean one way versus another. So this is where we want to talk about investing responsibly, centering community trust, knowing your values, understanding the biases, understanding the ethics of AI, ethical design on how we implement AI into workflows. And you don't have to hire agencies like mine in order to do it. You can attend classes and email me if you want any more information on that. And then how do you lead with oversight so this doesn't get away from you? I know, oh, I'm right at the end here. So I'm gonna kind of skip through, give you my contact information. I could talk about this all day long. I'm gonna answer some questions. Shyla, is it okay if I keep taking a couple questions before you cut me off?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I know there's a definitely,
Okay.
yeah, go ahead.
Okay, perfect. And if anybody has to leave, feel free to email me and we can talk after. Aaron's question regarding data and privacy and picking the right tool, what kinds of protections do you recommend looking for in data privacy, data sharing agreements? Thinking of the flock camera controversies, among others. Okay, this is a great question. And I would ask, it depends on the scenario, and and it depends on how much protection you have to offer. It also depends on the state privacy decisions that are already legislated versus, and then the industry that you work with. So I can't give you just a generic answer on this. I would ask you to look at, okay, what are my industry standards? What's the gold standard? And then in my state, what is the whether it's a privacy commissioner, office of privacy, what are they? Chelsea says, have you used AI to tag comments and comments for themes and then run data again and asking it to tag each comment based on the themes? I do. And I have an intern do it first, and then I go back and check it. I never trust one review. Um, I never trust an intern's review. I never trust an AI's review. I look at it before. So it speeds things up for sure, but I double check it. Jose says, I assume you are recording the meeting to produce the report and not entering the meeting notes into AI. Shyla responded to that. Okay, great. Maya, condo, thank you. I don't know why I could not think of that word. AI due diligence checklist. Can you please share the link? Yes, I can. And you can just Google Claude's AI digital checklist, due diligence. It's right here. If you can't access that, just Google it. It's under Claude, or email me. I'm happy to do that. Patricia says, will you be sending the link to the slides and the recordings? I'm happy to share the slide deck to Shyla, for you to share. Sherry says, curious, where do you see Copilot lacking compared to the strengths of Claude or ChatGPT on analytics or overall reliability? Great question. I don't like the style of writing Copilot gave me. So I'm a writer. I'm very particular about how I want to speak. I found it more robotic. Now, ChatGPT was excellent. I'm finding it really slow over the last few weeks. I think so many users are using it. I always liked Claude's style of writing better. Um, ChatGPT's deep research is better than Copilot. ChatGPT's deep research is slow though, but give it the time and ask it to check for hallucinations, ask it to check its sources, and then double check. Um, and Jillian, a City of Victoria, did you mention you have a course to help understand how to use AI models? I do. Email me and I can send you the link to all of our courses. I'd be happy to share that with you. And um, I know I've kind of gone over. I'm so sorry. I guess we're right at 12. Thank you so much for coming and listening to me. I know I hit that really fast and hard. And any suggestions on Canadian AI tools rather than ChatGPT or Claude from Sonny McDonald? I don't. Um, okay, so what I can say, University of Toronto Rotman School of Business is doing some really cool AI work, and they're doing all of the research to invest in Canadian AI tools that are coming up. So there's none that I would recommend for this scope. But if you look at Rotman's programs, they've got some really cool stuff happening. And really cool businesses that the Canadian feds are investing in. That makes me really happy to see that. Siggy says, Siggy, what a cool name. Also interested in the course options. Yes, please email me. Debbie, thank you. Ashley, thank you. And like I said, I'm always happy to talk to anybody about this topic. It's something that I'm really passionate about. And community engagement is something I'm really passionate about. So if I can help you do it more effectively for more people, don't ever hesitate to reach out and contact me. Um, and here's my email again. It's Catherine@alchemycommunications.ca. And oh, thank you, Christina. Thank you all. And we send out a newsletter and things like that. You can find all of that information on our website. But I really appreciate you having us, and thank you for inviting me, Shyla. I feel like I talked a mile a minute
Wonderful.
there.
This was great. Yeah, the applause, the hearts, the comments, the conversation. This was a really great webinar. And so thank you for being here. I think very informative communication that people, communicating this information that people were very interested in, and clearly interested in learning more, because I feel like we could keep going.
Yeah, it's such a complex topic. I
Yeah,
know it's
yeah,
hard to get it all in an hour. Yes.
well, wonderful. Well, this webinar has been recorded. We will get the recording sent out, and then it will also be posted on our member page on our website. And then, Catherine, if you are totally up to you, if you would like to share the slide deck, and I can also send
Yes.
those that were registered for today's webinar. So,
I'm happy to send that along. It's always impossible to take notes fast enough, especially when the person can't remember the word condo.
it's
So I'm
okay.
happy to send the slide deck. Yes. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you. Thank you.
Take care.